not now. Not these guys, not now. I'm thinking, man, is there another way? Can I sneak in the back or something like that? And I just kind of felt that sort of prick of conscience and God saying, no, you got to interact with these guys right now. And I'm all amped up for, they tend to be a little bit belligerent and very demanding. Our church has a ministry to them, and we'll feed them occasionally and that kind of thing. And I know I'm going to be the only one here for them to interact with, and they're just waiting for me. And so I'm preemptively like, how am I going to shut this down and get in there and get my job done? I'm ashamed to say, and try to do that in a way that comes across as gracious, right? And so I'm headed in, and heading ahead. I only have a key to the front door, and they're right there sitting in front of it. And as I'm going in, they're kind of looking at me scowly, and I'm like, all right, how's this going to go? And I was just like, hey guys, how's it going? And one of them just kind of looks at me and, well, I'm looking for a cup of coffee. And something in the back of my head just clicked. And I thought, you know what? I can do that. I said as much. I went in and I found some snacks and stuff that we had here at the church, and put together a couple of cups of coffee and brought them some creamer and everything, and set it on the front porch for them, and interacted with them real briefly, and headed in. And I felt the shift there internally. Some of that anger that I was dealing with kind of dissipated. I came up here to my office, and as I'm sitting down again, it's like, all right, nosed in, I got to get this done. I've got a time limit, and I just felt something internally. Hey, Jered, you haven't spent a whole lot of time with me today. And I'm thinking, now's not the time, God. I need to be obedient to you. I need to get some things done. And as I was thinking that, a particular song that's an encouragement to me came to mind, and I've got a Pandora account, and I jumped on to listen to that. And as I did that, I sat back, and it was just like a bunch of things just hit in a row. For whatever reason, the musical sequence that came across was just almost perfectly tailored to where I was at, kind of lift me out of sort of a rut that I was in. And as I was doing that, I felt kind of my heart overflow a little bit, and I just sort of had to get it on pen and paper and wrote a little bit. And honestly, I've been really struggling with this particular message, and just feeling a disconnect from it. And after kind of doing, not really poetic, but just kind of a little bit more kind of praise writing almost, I was able to kind of refocus and get in here and get this thing written. And whether it comes across as particularly spiritual or not remains to be seen. But that's kind of the heart that this flows out of. And what was interesting to me is I felt like that really illustrated the message itself. Last week we had talked about the aspect of getting out of the rut of a particular circumstance, of letting our view kind of raise a little bit to God, to who he is, to seeking his presence, to bringing our circumstances before him, to even sort of tilling the soil of those circumstances just with the work of praise, to sort of soften and remove obstacles. And in a lot of ways to focus, and that focus not being kind of down in the rut of what circumstances are, particularly with the world being in the situation that it is at current, and our own personal situations all being affected by that, and being able to kind of raise it up a little bit and see the wider scope and perspective of who God is, what he's doing, and our ability to bring things with him, and even have his presence and his peace in us in the midst of those things. And so again, the passage that we were looking at was Philippians 4 through 9. And we looked at 4 through 7 last week. And as promised, we're transitioning into 8 through 9. And just kind of with the bulk of those individual verses and how long they are, it essentially kind of splits the passage in half. And again, I'm going to read the whole thing, and then we'll get into our particular focus here on 8 and 9. And so it's Philippians 4 through 9. Rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near, or at hand, some translations say. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. So, coming off of that recap of last week, so we've been in this, process of discussing what it looks like to sort of till the soil of our circumstances, to lift our view. But once we've lifted that view, what then do we focus on? Because once we've done that, there is just a wealth of things that are all of a sudden within our scope of understanding, within this maybe not understanding, but at least the scope of that perspective that we talked about raising. We've gone from looking into the rut to seeing everything out on the horizon. And the beauty of this is that we've got a much wider perspective of what's going on and what God's doing in reality, who he is, and even the circumstances of those around us. But there's a lot there. And so what then, once we've done that, do we hone in on? And Paul gives us a pretty wide umbrella, but in verse 8 here, he gives pretty clear challenge to that. And it's, again, in verse 8, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, lovely, admirable, if anything is excellent, praiseworthy, think about such things. And so this is what he's telling us. When you look up and you've got your perspective up and you're looking at the wider horizon, here's where you key in on. Now, this is a really wide umbrella. And in one sense, that can be kind of daunting. It might be nice to have a little bit more specific advice here or challenge. But on the other hand, it's kind of cool because as we're looking at that wide world, that whole wide world is open for our engagement. We've worked to prepare our hearts, and he's saying, now here's what you key in on. Here's what you look for, and here's what you fill your mind and your heart with. And again, I like this because we all have our own unique perspective on this when we look up. We all have our own corner on the reality of who God is, his personality, what he's doing, and an ability to see certain things when we look up. We all have different spiritual gifts. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. We all have different wiring. And so God's not pigeonholing any one of those things as being the right thing. He's saying, hey, if anything falls under this wide category of things, whether that's beauty, lovely, admirable, noble, right, true, praiseworthy, that's all fair game. And that's what I want you to go after. So if there's something that just stands out to me, particularly as I've got my head out of the rut, Paul says, go for it. As long as it's something with redeeming value, as long as it's something worth going after. And the litmus test for that is this list of things he's given. So I think the converse, if you look at each of these things, there's an opposite for them as well. So if something is degenerate as opposed to noble, if something is untrue, if something is impure, if something is not very lovely, if something is not admirable, if it is the opposite of excellent, if it's just poor and shoddy, if it's not worthy of praise, don't focus there. And it sounds overly simplistic in some ways. And as I've thought about this myself, there's almost a detractor in the sense that in modern psychology, you have a lot of this positive thinking, mindset. And what's interesting to me is, you can do that in a sense, even without an engagement to God. I think there's general grace and general beauty in things that God has put in the world that in some ways you don't necessarily have to acknowledge him to see. But the reality is this is just almost a universal principle that God has built into his creation. Is that if you, in a sense, have a positive thinking mindset, it's going to do beneficial things for you. It's going to set a stage for you. And we see at the end of 9 that the God of peace, not only will he put peace in us that guards our hearts, but his presence himself as the God of peace is going to be resident and present in that heart. And so I think sometimes it's easy to discount a lot of that positive thinking rhetoric and talk that we hear, even from like a modern psychological perspective. But we got to remember, Paul himself says, whatever is true and whatever is pure and lovely is fair game. Even if it's presented from a skewed perspective, there's a sense there where we can glean the truth out of it, not discount it, and remember they're getting it from an ultimate source of truth, and it's not the other way around, if that makes sense. And so I know for me, the real challenge in this, in the midst of all of the difficulty, I appreciated that reading that Lenny did there, because it talked about a lot of the things that we're all struggling with, some level, the walls that are being built up. I'm especially cognizant of that as I look at the social media. My wife is much more active in it than I am for personal reasons that I don't need to get into totally right now. I've kind of backed off a lot of the Facebook and social media stuff. It's just almost because of this principle here, because it's just been a constant drag for me. And I mean, I do want to engage in the world around me, but I found that I need to do that selectively, particularly when it comes to social media. So anyway, but sort of almost secondhand, just what I'm getting from my wife, there's just a lot of caustic conversation going on. Just people, there's the different perspectives on how to handle these things, and it's disheartening. People that I personally know that have been good friends and that have been just support to one another are now in this process of bickering and backbiting online because of their different perspectives on things, and just it's sad. And to the point where our pastor here kind of at the Alliance Bible Church here in Anchorage came out with a kind of like a special update thing in the middle of the week that was just like, hey guys, and he really waded into that to challenge us in our congregation. Let's not let this be the ruling factor of where we're going. And I really appreciated how we went about doing that. And again, I think that comes back down to focus and, what is my goal and how am I engaging in things? And, but for me, I want to shrink back. I don't want to look up to the wider view of things, because that's all out there. Right. And a lot of that's negative. And that's one of the things that's scary sometimes maybe about getting our heads kind of up out of a rut is then we're up and we're seeing everything on the horizon, good and bad. And Paul, I think, is definitely acknowledging all of that. And because of all of that, he's saying it's going to be really easy to get bogged down if you don't have a disciplined focus about what you're choosing to look for and take in. And the beauty of that is, even in this one example that I'm talking about of kind of the backbiting on social media, even if somebody has a different perspective than I do, oftentimes there's still something in there that I can look for that has an element of one of these things, whether that be truth or an admirable desire to, engage the circumstances or whatever. I can usually find something in there of redeeming value. And once I've done that, I find oftentimes the defenses come down, and then we're willing to have a conversation. And even if I don't and I can't find something, I can still find some aspect of love to be able to engage this with. And I was really struck by that when the pastor of the church here came out with that, and challenged by that. And again, it just really fits into the concept that we're talking about here. And again, I don't want to get stuck there for too long here. And that's, for me, in some sense, been the hard thing about doing a message on this, is there's so much crammed into these passages and so much applicable content there. Though at face value, it might seem pretty simple, that I almost have to be disciplined about what I'm dragging this out with and applying it to. So again, taking that, just once we're out of the rut, there's a lot out there to focus on, and it'd be easy to overwhelm. But I think Paul's saying it's okay to take a few beautiful things, a few lovely things, a few praiseworthy things, and just engage there, go after it. You don't have to take everything, I don't think, is what he's saying. I'm just saying, if there's something in there under this broad category, camp out there for a while, focus on it. And there's a lot out there. So there's a lot of opportunity. And for me, as I've done that, as I've raised my perspective, I've been amazed at how much there's been out there for me to focus on, whether that's even within my little family, the positives of being able to spend more time with them, being able to encourage other people that I know that are getting bogged down and are struggling with things. Just even sending a text message to a friend that I was struggling with some work things and got a new job, and just to engage them and, hey, how's that going? Instead of getting so stuck in my own rut of things. And that's one thing that I've noticed, is that when I'm focused on me, almost inevitably, my focus tends to come down. Because I'm trying to, we're sort of made to look outward, and when we're focused inward, we miss a lot. And we miss all of these things under this category that Paul is talking about. And he goes on from there. So once we've done that, again, his next step from what we were talking about last week, and that sort of tilling of the soil and that refocusing and giving things up to him and starting to cultivate his peace in us, is this next step in 8, which is almost another mental step, and it's another focus step. And so in 9, he finally gets to kind of like, okay, when you've done that, when you're finally in this position of being able to, one, be able to even get a perspective, be able to see what's going on around you, and then have this perspective of looking for the positive things, the lovely things. Now we're in a position finally to be able to do something. And it's interesting to me that Paul doesn't just necessarily go, all right, you've done that, you've cultivated your mindset, you've looked at, you've focused on the beautiful, the right, the praiseworthy, the excellent. You've got a perspective on that. He doesn't just go, and then go for it. He kind of switches it a little bit to this track of, now, what I want you to do is whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, that's what I want you to then put into practice once you've got all this in perspective. And for some reason, that kind of stuck with me a little bit, and I had to think about that. And something that I've struggled with Paul is, I don't know if it's just me, but I struggle with sometimes falling into the trap of thinking maybe this guy's a little bit arrogant, because it's just kind of like, and then do like me. And I'm like, man, I wouldn't even think of saying that to somebody, if I'm giving them good advice. And here's the best practical advice that I can give you: do like I do. But I kind of had to get over my initial reaction to that and start really thinking about, well, where is this guy coming from? And what's he trying to address here? And the reality is he's trying to address people that don't have the entire New Testament, first of all, like we have it. They don't have all the written principles. And in some ways, they've got the Old Testament and some familiarity with that, but even that is kind of an oral tradition. A lot of them, most of them, the great majority, don't have anything written down. It's just what they've gotten from memory and what they've heard from people who are reciting it to them and preaching it to them and interpreting for them. So in a lot of ways, their revelation from God is through guys like Paul, like Peter, like the others that are sort of the living embodiment of the Word of God. They're sort of the disciples, that living example, guys that are inspired by God's Spirit to be able to speak and do truth. And then I think of 1 Corinthians 11:1, where Paul's saying, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And I thought about that, and I was kind of, again, struck by that. The reality is these people are receiving a letter from somebody who's really submitted to Christ, who knows Christ in a way that is far beyond where I'm at, and to a level that's well beyond where I'm at, to the reality of, when he says this, he's saying, do like I do. He's saying, because I'm doing like Christ does. And again, as I mentioned last week, if you look at the example that he's setting for him, he is living this message out perfectly. He is literally in chains and in prison. And what better circumstance to be focused on the difficulties of your own circumstance and where you're at, and just trying to plod through it or make it through it. And what's he doing in the midst of that? He's writing this letter to him. He's writing this encouragement. His focus isn't here, navel gazing on Paul and his own difficult circumstances. It's up, and it's realizing, one, the reality of the circumstances that the Philippians in, their needs, both emotional and spiritual and even physical. And he's saying, and he's writing, and he's and he's loving on these guys. And he's doing that. A lot of this letter is a very encouraging letter. He's giving God thanks for them and for what they're doing and where they're at. He's encouraging them in their giving and their ministry. He's addressing needs, and we see him a little bit later on talking about trying to unify some division that's in their church there. And he's doing exactly what he's talking about. And beyond even what he's just writing to them, he's just saying, whatever you've seen me do or heard me talk about, or whatever benefit there is that you've seen in what I'm doing, that's all that's fair game. And I thought, that's cool. He doesn't just take it to a wide open and do whatever you think is right. He's doing what's modeled for you by somebody who's already been through the trial and error, in a sense, somebody who's ahead of you, maybe even spiritually. And I thought of a principle that I've been told multiple times in my life, and it's just, if you want to excel at something, if you want to be good at something, if you want to cultivate a certain benefit, gift, talent, whatever in your own life, find somebody who's excellent at it and do what they do. And usually, for most of us, that's the best way to get good at something. That's the best way to cultivate a habit or a talent or a benefit or a skill set in our life. It's to find somebody who's good at it and just mimic that. Now, over time, you're going to be able to personalize that, tailor it a little bit more towards you. But one, you're not going to be reinventing the wheel, and two, you're going on good authority. Success stands up to a lot of scrutiny, and I think Paul's just saying, hey, this is the lifestyle I've lived this out. I'm enjoying the fruit of it. I'm moving towards the eternity of it, and I'd love for you to experience that as well. So let's go on and let's do this together. And the result of that then being is that the God of peace will be with you. And I appreciate that he doesn't just transition into, and then all your circumstances will just line up and everything will be great. Because it may not. And if you look at the reality of some of the most dedicated servants who have most successfully lived out these principles in their life, especially from a biblical perspective, a lot of them were honestly tortured to death. If you look at Jesus Christ, who's Paul saying is my example, who's the secondary, my example is following his example, and so follow that example. Jesus Christ's example, he died on a cross, and he was more successful with this than any of us. So it's not so much that circumstances get easier, it's just that in the midst of them, the God of peace is taking up residence with you. And for me, if I think back to my circumstances on Friday, it wasn't that the circumstances of anything that I'm going through changed. Not really a single thing about the external circumstances that I was struggling with or dealing with changed. It's just that there was a presence with me in the midst of that all of a sudden gave me something to engage it. It was this internal presence, and there was for me, almost a palpable sense of that as I'm in the midst of this kind of thing, of just this sort of the Holy Spirit and this peace that just kind of descended on me internally. And it was all of a sudden not just me and my self-focused ability to be able to engage everything, because that's what I came in here to do, was to get something done and really to do it on my own steam. And all of a sudden, this additional presence was there and present with me. I said, all right, now you're ready to do this. And I remember for me, it was just this palpable sense of peace, the sense of joy, the sense of rejoicing, the sense of I have something that I didn't have when I walked into these circumstances before. And for me, it's kind of one of the harder elements of preaching sometimes in any principle, is that we kind of do our part of obedience, and God says, and this is my part, to take up residence, to give you peace, to guard your heart. And that's totally on his initiative and in his ability. And there's a certain level where we cultivate that, where we turn to him in that, but then we're just totally dependent on him following through. And that's the part where, for me, there's that faith element to it, but there's only so far I can go with that in terms of being able to do anything on my own. And the only point that I can really get to in that is that point of surrender, is that point of, okay, I've brought it to him, I've cultivated these things, and now it's up to him to just kind of descend into the middle of it. And I'm amazed at how often that, for me personally, he does actually do that. And again, I've talked about being a little bit of a pessimist, and it's hard for me to trust in that. I think it's hard for any of us to trust in that because it doesn't make sense. It goes back up to verse 7 there, where he talks about it transcends all understanding. It's not something that you're just going to figure out. And then once you figured it out, you get the benefit of it, which for me is my MO. That's how I do it. A lot of people, approach things differently. I learn everything that I can about something so that I know I'm doing it right. And in these circumstances, it's not as much a sense of doing it right. It's a sense of surrendering it to him and having the trust to be able to let go. And that's the great thing of letting go of anxiousness, because that's me kind of being tight-fisted of having to kind of figure it out. And when I let it go, then I'm giving God the opportunity to do that. And my eyes are opened up to all of the different things that I can do that follows under all of these categories that we said, which is very broad. All of what Paul has done, modeled, and taught, fair game, things that are lovely that we've filled our minds with, and it's all there, open and wide open to us. And in doing that, on top of all of that, this presence of this God who's able, capable, majestic, steps in and empowers that as we're moving forward in it, if that makes sense. And that's what I find for me is oftentimes I step in it, and then when I'm met with, whether it's a task, whether it's just trying to overcome a personal difficulty, it's not often until I've let go of all of my misgivings and I've put my hand to the plow, so to speak, that all of a sudden something else seems to come in there and grab hold of that with me. And all of a sudden it starts moving forward. And it's like, wow, this isn't just me. And it's well beyond anything that I thought I was about to just do on my own. And I think, so practically speaking, it's one thing to kind of theorize about this, but what does it look like for us to do it? You kind of heard my own personal example of it. But for the rest of us, what does that look like? And first off, I think it's going to look probably different for all of us. There's not like, okay, here's what you need to do, a specific application, but I think there's probably some corner of this that God is trying to work in all of us right now. Probably something that we might even been resisting. I know for me coming into the church, there was definitely a tangible sense of, I'm doing this out of obedience. I've got my nose to the grindstone and I'm doing what I need to do, and I'm plodding through because that's what I need to do. I'm trying to cultivate this, attitude of, it should be love and acceptance, but it was more an attitude of tolerance and, putting up with my wife and my child and even these homeless guys out front and that kind of stuff. And to me, that's I'm being obedient. I'm doing what I need to do. And God kind of had to shake me out of that a little bit. And it was hard because of that for me to even see that I'm kind of in this very rut that I've been preaching about getting out of. And it took stepping back, like Paul is saying here. I'm connecting with God. I'm starting to open up, expand that field of view to be able to even see some of these upper opportunities. For me, it was these homeless guys. And I'm wondering what those things are for us. What God points us to when we step back to that. Is there a relationship in my life right now that needs to be reconciled? Is there somebody that I'm angry with, mad at? Because maybe even how they're responding to this COVID thing, or they've got a different field of view. Somebody that I might have had a previously good relationship with that we're at odds with. That's something that, I know for Jessica has been a struggle in the midst of this, has been an application for her. She's gone in and gone back to those people and said, hey, the way I approached this was like this. And, I want to come back and say, hey, and restore that. I want to come back and say that was wrong in my approach. Even if I feel like I have a point over here, I want to cement the fact that we are friends, brothers and sisters in Christ, that we love each other. That's an example for her. maybe it's as simple as doing something practical around the house. It sounds funny, but sometimes for me, as I step back and open my field of vision up from the difficulty that I've been trudging through, I noticed that yesterday that the bathrooms were real dirty, and that was an opportunity for me to be a blessing to my wife. She's working, she's helping support our family, and I was trying to get some other things done, but I realized, man, I bet you that'd be a huge blessing if I clean the toilet. She's been talking about needing to do it, and I'm like, I'm just going to do it. I've got a few minutes, and I did, and she noticed, and that was a blessing to her. Another thing, engaging with a neighbor that I've been meaning to talk to. I've been meaning to establish that bridge of what might even be a potential opportunity to share Christ. Because social distancing and doing that appropriately, but just, hey, how's it going? I'm an introverted person. That's a discipline for me, so I can connect with that if that's something that you've been kind of wrestling with. And I think Paul here, in a sense, is saying, is that something that could be enjoyable, beautiful, true, real, communicate truth? Go for it. Why not? At least you've tried. And at least you're getting yourself beyond your own difficulties, and you're being a blessing, and you're engaging somewhere. And that's the beauty of this to me, is there is a whole wide world of things that we can do. Maybe reading a book that you've been needing to read, something that has an elevating message to it, a redeeming perspective. Whatever it is, I think just going back to God, and as we've established that connection that we talked about last week, being able to kind of open our minds, and if something's back there, pursue it, explore it. Not everything's going to pan out, but at least we have a far better chance of engaging in something on a redemptive level than we would have if we just kind of stuck back on our heels, so to speak. So I just want to encourage you to kind of take some time to kind of dream a little bit this week and explore, what would I like to do, and think about why can't I? What's holding me back from doing that? And is it something that's the opposite of one of these categories? Is it fear? Is it lack of truth? Whatever. And put it against this test and say, based on what I know of Scripture, based on what I've seen in other holy examples and people that I've seen serving and following Christ, is it something that's fair game for me? And why not pursue it? So again, kind of in that vein, what might happen if I dreamed a little bit here? What if I restored that relationship and I reestablished that and got that off my weight? What if I made that connection with my neighbor and down the road they came to know and accept Christ? What if I clean that toilet and it's a blessing and just a weight off of somebody's shoulders? There's a whole host of things, and what's great is it's kind of a self-perpetuating lifestyle and a mindset. It breeds the very things that Paul is talking about here. By focusing and engaging in the admirable, in the beautiful, in the pure, in the excellent, I reproduce the admirable, the beautiful, the lovely, the pure, and the excellent. And there's more for me to focus on and more for everybody else to focus on. And it doesn't just cultivate for me, it's got an exponential effect. I've talked about how COVID, if one person is touched by it, that person touches 10 people, that person touches 100. The same effect is true on this. And if one person is affected by this loveliness, this beautiful, I feel like this is kind of like the counter disease in a sense. We're fighting what's degenerate and evil with what's beautiful and good and what's right. And that's also a biblical principle. And so to kind of wrap this up, I'm going to wrap it up here. I need to wind her down. I've been yammering for about a half an hour. And so I'm gonna shut it down. And what I'm gonna be a little bit vulnerable here. And like I said, when I felt like I had this interaction with God that started with the homeless guys out front, which sort of brought me into this experience of just having just this experience of feeling like Christ just kind of filling my heart refreshed with His presence and with His peace. I said I just kind of wrote down out of what I was feeling, and I don't claim this to be poetry or anything. It was just kind of the overflow of my heart at the time, and I feel like God was just kind of like, okay, go ahead and share that. And this is what I wrote. Like I said, I don't claim it's poetry. It's just kind of the overflow of my heart. Here is my place, where my heart is free, where the bonds are broken, where I want to be. Beauty compressed, my heart runs well over. A minute or two and I've escaped, out from under the pressure, out from under the weight. When I lift my eyes, it's just you. Arms open, arms big enough, and open, always open. Was it mine that were shut tight? But there you are, and here I am too, and it's you. It's you, and I love you. Father God, I pray that out of your glorious riches, you may strengthen us with the power through your Spirit in our inner being, so that Christ may dwell in our hearts through faith. And I pray that we